Because of the overwhelming enthusiasm the last time I did a costume breakdown, I decided, why not do another one? Who knows, maybe it might become a series. Today I'd like to do a costume breakdown of a character that I play at a sci-fi LARP, Ilia Devin. First I'll give a short introduction on what the LARP itself is about, then we'll take a closer look at the costume, and then I'll talk about how I actually made these parts, because all of this is daily wear that you can find in normal pattern magazines. But first, a short introduction of the LARP itself, which is always interesting because these stories can get huge. Anyway, as I said, it is a sci-fi LARP that takes place just across the border in Belgium. There's around 100-150 people each event, and the story is pretty simple. Humans had to abandon Earth and were way ahead in the future, and now suddenly there are aliens attacking us. Another theme that's quite big at this LARP is interfactional conflict, because of course humans have divided themselves up in 5 factions. Because it's relevant to how I designed my costume, I'll give a very short rundown of each of them. The 5 factions are as follows. There is a heavily military inspired, you really need to fill out this form 3 times, kind of American stereotype faction. There's a faction that's all about family and honor, clothing wise also slightly Asian inspired. Then there's a faction that's slightly more chaotic in the way it is organized and contains more of the industrial kind of things. Clothing wise and such, it is slightly Russian inspired. There is a faction that's all about the money. You are an adult if you have paid off the debt to your parents for raising you. Clothing wise, it is slightly more Arabian inspired. And then there's the faction that I play. We're basically space priests, so long robes, all that sort of stuff. So, let's take a closer look at the costume itself. Well, here we go with the costume itself. Ilia is a researcher, just fresh off university, off to this colony and basically not entirely knowing what she's getting into, but nonetheless. The idea for my character was that she studied at a planet of another one of the factions, so there is slight hints and nudges to the other faction in the costume. First of all, these events take place at the end of spring, beginning of summer, and end of autumn, almost start of winter, so it needed to be slightly warm. So there are multiple layers to this costume. First of all, I have a regular undershirt. It's what you see here in the sleeves, and just for warmth here. Then over that we have a white shirt. It's a very plain t-shirt material shirt. The only reason I made this basically was to have something interesting going on with the sleeves. And then we have, the over thingy. I had cut out the pattern and I decided that it was way too plain. So I cut it up in bits and pieces, put it all together, and then decided that the inside actually looked more interesting than the outside. It's semi-asymmetrical, it's slightly chaotic, and I think that works for, the kind of priest characters that we play. It also has a nice, really nice big hood, so yeah. Then we have our goddess, of which this is the symbol, and one of the other players has a laser engraving machine, so he made these wooden amulets. Aside from that, there is of course many pouches, as a slight nudge to the other faction where my character studied, which is more black and red colors of clothing that they wear. I have leather gloves and I am wearing a short sword, which is also a nudge to that faction. In my case, I've got these attached, which basically means this weapon has been blessed by our goddess and it can do certain types of damage. Plus, I just think it looks pretty. And aside from this costume, my mannequin does not wear pants, but I do. I made these pants, which are the most comfy pants ever, and of course, they have giant pockets. That's it for the under layers of my costume. But then the second event came around, and I realized it's almost December. This might not be warm enough. So I built her this absolutely giant coat. It's made from a fake leather that I bought at the curtain section of the fabric store. I like it. It's actually really swishy. When I turn around in this, the coat billows out nicely, even though it's quite heavy. The nicest thing about this is no wind gets through this, so it's nice and warm. Aside from that, it also, again, has giant pockets in which I can hide all sorts of things. One detail that I really like about this coat is the back, where I added yet another sign of our goddess. So even in other situations, I am nicely recognizable. And that's basically all the different pieces that I've got for this costume. It's not the most complicated costume, but I think all the little bits do add to something that visually looks pretty okay. But now, how did I actually make all of these pieces? Where did I get the inspiration from? Well, I just browsed through daily wear pattern magazines. Let me show you. Here we go. These are 3 of the 4 patterns that I used to make my Aelia costume. Do you recognize them? Now I have to confess there is a 4th one which I couldn't find due to not correct documentation, but that's another lesson. Anyway, let's see how I got to these patterns and from these patterns to the eventual costume. I guess this one is the easiest to start with. I knew I wanted something over it with really big armholes and an interesting kind of sleeve. I knew of this pattern because I had made something quite like this before, just for normal daily wear. So I remembered these sleeves and I just thought, if you have really big armholes, this looks really interesting. However, this is a blouse with a front closure. So what I did was I traced the entire pattern as normal. However, at the mid-front, I ignored all the parts that were for the buttons and just attached these together. So because of the way that this pattern is, that just means that you get 1 center panel and 2 side panels in which the sleeve is inserted. So for the pants, which is also pretty easy, I knew 2 things. I wanted slightly baggy, comfy pants, and I wanted pockets. In that case, what I do is I grab my entire collection of pattern magazines and just flip through them until I find a pattern that I like. Which in this case was, well, these pants. These are all the same pattern. It's them showing what you can do with the same pattern. This is basically the pattern that I used. The only change I made here is that I took away the drawstrings because I thought they weren't necessary. In my case, I just tightened up the elastic on the sides a slightly bit. So now it fits as normal and I don't have the drawstrings because that's unnecessary in my costume as there will be clothing over this. I unfortunately couldn't find the pattern magazine anymore, but I do store all my patterns in these folders. I also include a tiny strip of the fabric so that I can easily find which pattern belongs to which piece of clothing that I made. To explain what I did for this pattern without having the magazine is I basically looked for a pattern that was slightly loose with really big armholes. And then, because I thought just the simple shape of the pattern itself would be slightly boring, I just cut it up into pieces. And that's what you can see here, my slight own diagram on how I cut up the pieces, just so I could find them back easily later. I've got that for the front, and I got one for the back. And that's basically how I made the tunic that goes over it. For the coat, what I knew that I wanted was a long coat, preferably slightly billowy. Inside-out seams would always be interesting. And then I remembered that this one was on the cover of one of the magazines and I figured this is a nice project to make it. And honestly, I hardly changed a thing on this. I left out the cuffs. I think that's it. Also, as you can see already on the back, it's pretty much the same. The only thing that I did specifically for this costume was that I grabbed 2 different colors of fake leather and switched them around so that it was a slightly more interesting coat to look at rather than just one big surface in the same color. And that's basically it on how I designed my Aelia costume. I haven't played her that many events yet, so there isn't as nice as a progression as there is with my Vortex character, but nonetheless I hope you enjoyed the insight in how I designed this. And with that, thank you all for watching and see you guys next time.